My name is Chloe, and I am 34 years old, and I am lying flat on a narrow bed in the intensive care unit with harsh white lights above me, and a steady beeping sound drilling into my head like a slow, relentless clock, counting down something I cannot see, yet my body already knows that something is very wrong, because the pain in my side is not normal pain, and not something you breathe through or wait out, but a deep burning pressure that feels like it is tearing me open from the inside. And when the doctor finally leans close enough for me to see his face clearly, he tells me I need emergency surgery on my spleen, and his voice is calm but serious, and he says it in the way doctors do when they are trying not to scare you but also not lie. And in that moment my first instinct is not fear or panic or even the pain, but my parents, because that has always been my instinct ever since I was a child. And I reach for my phone with shaking hands, and I start calling them again and again, even though I have already been calling them for 3 hours straight with no answer. And every time the phone rings without being picked up, it feels like another small confirmation of something I have known my whole life but never wanted to fully admit. And as I lie there staring at the ceiling trying to keep my breathing steady, I finally learn the reason they have been ignoring me. And it is not because they cannot answer, or because they are on the way, or because they are stuck in traffic, but because my sister Bianca is having a meltdown over paint, because the contractor bought glacier white instead of snowfall white, and my parents chose her tantrum over my life-threatening emergency. And that truth settles into me heavier than the pain in my body, because this is not new, it is just louder and more undeniable than it has ever been. And as the machines keep beeping beside me, my mind drifts back to how I ended up here just hours earlier, when I was standing in my sister's half-built mansion that she and her husband Josh were pouring almost $2 million of family trust money into, and she had insisted I come see it because she wanted admiration, not advice. And I knew that the moment I stepped inside and smelled sawdust and fresh paint and saw tools and cords scattered everywhere without care, because that is how Bianca has always lived her life, with other people cleaning up the mess. And when I noticed the temporary balcony railing on the second floor wobbling under my hand, I said something, because that is who I am and what I do for a living as a risk analyst. And I told her it was dangerous and violated safety standards and would not hold weight if someone fell against it. And Josh brushed it off, and Bianca snapped at me like she always does, telling me to stop ruining her dream. And then she shoved me, not hard, not violently, but with the same careless, entitled push she has used since we were kids to move me out of her way, and my heel caught on a cord left across the floor, and I reached for the railing that snapped like cheap wood in my hand. And then there was nothing but air, and then concrete, and then darkness, and the last thing I heard before everything went black was Bianca screaming, not in fear, but in shock, and Josh arguing about calling an ambulance because inspectors would shut the site down and ruin his career. And when I wake up in the ICU with tubes in my nose and pain flooding my body, I ask the nurse if my family is here, and she pauses just long enough for me to know the answer before she even says it. And when she tells me they have been called multiple times and no one has come, the word family feels bitter in my mouth, and I ask for my phone again, and I finally get through to my mother, and instead of concern or panic, she sounds annoyed and rushed and tells me she is in the middle of a real crisis because Bianca is breaking down. And when I try to tell her I am in the ICU, she hangs up on me. And when the nurse calls her from the hospital line and explains clearly that I am bleeding internally and need immediate surgery, my mother asks if I am dying and then hangs up again because Bianca is still upset about paint. And in that moment, something inside me breaks and settles at the same time, because it is no longer confusion or doubt but clarity. And as the nurse looks at me with anger and disbelief and tells me she has never seen anything like this in her years of work, I finally understand that my family choosing Bianca over me is not an accident or a phase or bad timing, but a pattern that has defined my entire life. And as the doctors prepare me for surgery without my parents' consent, because they are allowed to do that in emergencies, I ask the nurse to make one more call, not to my family, but to my Lawyer, because there is something they do not know, something my grandmother, who was the only person who ever truly saw me, had put into motion long before this moment, and as I am wheeled down the hallway toward the operating room with bright lights passing overhead and the pain pulsing through my side, I realize that by ignoring my calls, my parents did not just abandon me, but triggered something irreversible. And while they are still standing in a paint store soothing Bianca and choosing shades of white, I am about to survive something they never imagined would cost them everything. And as the anesthesia pulls me under and the beeping fades, the last clear thought I have is that this is the moment my life changes, not because of the fall or the surgery, but because the truth has finally been exposed, and once the truth is exposed, there is no going back. Waking up from surgery was like dragging myself up through heavy freezing water with weights tied to my limbs, and every breath felt like it had to fight its way through mud. And when I finally opened my eyes, I was back in the same ICU room, but the ceiling looked farther away, and the pain had changed. It was no longer sharp and searing, but deep and pulsing like a bruise on the inside of my soul, and everything in my body felt too heavy to move, like I had been filled with cement. But through that fog I saw him, a man in a dark tailored suit, sitting quietly in the chair next to my bed, his hands folded and his eyes sharp and alert, and I blinked and tried to speak. And when I did, the name that came out was not my father's or my mother's or even my sister's. It was Terence, and he stood immediately, his presence pushing away the weakness and fear like light through fog, and he came to my side and said my name with a voice that carried reassurance and command at the same time, and told me I was stable, that the surgery had gone well, that I was out of danger physically, and that the doctor had said I would recover. But then his expression shifted slightly, and he said the nurse Tamika had called him the moment I was wheeled into the operating room, and had explained everything: the ignored calls, the paint store, the comment about real crises. And I nodded slowly, because I remembered all of it too clearly to even pretend it was a blur. And Terence's face turned serious and said, "Chloe, your grandmother saw this coming, not in exact detail, but in spirit, and she planned for this moment because she knew them. She knew exactly what kind of people your parents were and what your sister was, and most importantly, she knew what you were." And he said that when my grandmother Althea had set up the family trust before her passing 2 years ago, she had not simply handed over everything to my parents, even though they pretended like they had inherited everything, because that is how they act with everything like it belongs to them by default. She had instead placed every asset inside a secure trust: the family house, the money, the cars, the properties, the funding for Bianca's mansion, even the credit cards, and all of it was legally controlled by the trust, not owned by my parents, and that the trust had very specific conditions, including a clause, one written specifically to account for moments like this. And that clause 12 section B, was known as the integrity clause, and it stated that if the trustees, meaning Marcus and Vivian, were ever found guilty of gross negligence or severe moral failure against any beneficiary, then they would be removed from their position, and control would be passed to the most competent and moral remaining beneficiary. And that beneficiary was me, because my grandmother had named me the fallback, the safeguard, the one who could be trusted with everything if my parents ever showed their true selves, which they just had, and not just in some private conversation, but with recorded calls, witness testimony, and verifiable hospital records. And Terence explained that he had already started the legal process, that Nurse Tamika had agreed to testify, that audio recordings of the calls had been preserved, and that he was invoking Clause 12B on my behalf as my legal representative and as the appointed executor of the trust. And while my parents were still sipping wine and laughing about glacier white versus snowfall white, they had no idea that they were already being stripped of everything they thought was theirs, and that they would soon learn that by ignoring an ICU call from a nurse about their daughter's internal bleeding, they had triggered the clause that would change the course of their lives forever. And I lay there in silence, listening to every word, and as weak as I was, I felt something powerful rising in me, not revenge, Not anger but justice, because this was not about paint, this was not about jealousy or rivalry, this was about decades of emotional neglect, a lifetime of being treated like the boring, reliable one, the one they could overlook and underappreciate, while pouring every ounce of attention and wealth into. Bianca and Terence said that my grandmother had spent years quietly following my career, that she knew I had gone into forensic accounting and risk analysis, and she had seen the reports I published and read about the nonprofit fraud case I had cracked, and she had chosen me not because I was family, but because I was competent and moral and trustworthy, and that in the eyes of the law and the terms of the trust, I was now the rightful manager of the entire $100 million Dubois estate. And I closed my eyes and felt a peace settle over me deeper than any medication could provide, because they had spent years trying to make me feel small and replaceable, but in the end it was me who had been chosen, and they had failed the test they did not even know they were taking. And as Terence organized the documents and prepared the affidavits and began setting up the meetings and court filing, I simply lay there in the hospital bed with machines beeping beside me and thought about the irony that it took them nearly killing me to finally see me, and yet when they did it would not be in the way they had ever expected, because I would not scream or beg or cry. Instead, I would let the law, the trust and the truth speak for me, and they would hear it not in my voice, but in the silence of their declined credit cards, the closed accounts, the frozen funds, and the lawsuits they could not outrun. And I thought about what my grandmother must have felt as she wrote those words in her will about trust and integrity, and I hoped she knew even now that I would protect everything she built, and that her legacy would be safe with me, and not lost to marble counters and vanity mansions and empty shallow status symbols. And as Terence left the room promising to return soon, I closed my eyes, and this time I did not feel pain or fear or even anger. I felt clarity, I felt power, and I felt the certainty that from this moment on the family dynamics had shifted forever, and no matter how much they cried or screamed or denied it, the truth was already documented, signed, and in motion, and there was no going back. The next morning arrived far too soon, and though my body still ached from the surgery, and my side pulsed with every small movement, my mind was sharper than it had been in years, and I lay there in the sterile white quiet of the ICU room, surrounded by beeping monitors and the low hum of distant machines, waiting because Terence had told me that my family would come, and not because they cared, or were finally choosing me over Bianca, but because by now they would have been informed by the hospital staff that I had survived, and they would be arriving not with concern or remorse, but with rehearsed lines and justifications, and probably another basket of cheap fruit meant to look like sympathy. And sure enough, right around 10 o'clock in the morning, the door swung open without so much as a knock, and my father Marcus entered first, holding the door like a man reluctantly fulfilling a chore, followed by my mother Vivian carrying a sad plastic-wrapped fruit arrangement. And behind them came Bianca and Josh, the perfect golden couple, looking freshly polished and only mildly inconvenienced by this hospital detour, and my mother chirped out my name in a tone too high and too bright, and placed the basket on the far corner of the table where I could not even reach it, and she launched into her explanation about how sorry they were, and how they had tried to call back, but were told I was in surgery, and how things with Bianca had been simply impossible, and how the paint crisis was just overwhelming. And I just lay there and said nothing, because I wanted to hear the full story they had cooked up. And my sister Bianca looked at me with wide, dewy eyes and said she was devastated, and that she had no idea it was so serious, and that she froze and panicked, and that Josh had called the ambulance immediately, and he nodded with performative seriousness, backing up her lie, and said it had all happened so fast, and that they were terrified and did not know what to do. And I watched them all standing there weaving this narrative with smooth precision. And then my mother jumped in and said that Josh was a hero who carried me out of the construction site and called for help, and that it must all be a blur for me, and that I must not remember it clearly. And my father stepped forward and told me firmly that this was not the time for accusations, and that the focus should be on healing family, and that we needed to move forward and forgive. And at that moment I turned my head and looked directly at Josh, and I let the silence stretch until he started to squirm. And then I asked him in a soft, calm voice if he had called 911 the moment I fell, or if it had been after Bianca. shouted that his career would be ruined if the inspectors came, and I watched his face go pale and his mouth open and close without words, and Bianca's expression snapped from fake tears to pure rage, and then back to fake concern so fast it made my stomach turn, and my mother gasped and said, "How dare I say such a thing?" And my father growled that this was enough and that I was being dramatic and accusing the wrong people, and I just looked at them all as they launched into their defensive tirades, and I let the lies pile up in the room like smoke because I knew something they did not know. I knew that they were already standing on a trapdoor that was about to open, and that everything they thought they owned and controlled was already gone, and so I turned my head slightly to the quiet corner of the room where Terence Cole sat in complete silence, his legs crossed, his suit impeccable, and his expression unreadable, and I gave him the smallest nod, and he rose slowly with deliberate grace and walked to the foot of my bed and placed his briefcase on the table, and the sound of the leather against plastic snapped everyone into silence, and my father turned sharply and demanded to know who this man was and what he was doing here, and my mother asked if he was with billing and started to protest that they had insurance, and Terence simply ignored them and introduced himself calmly and clearly as the executive of the Althea Dubois Family Trust, and the moment he said those words the room shifted like the air had been sucked out, and all the false sympathy vanished from their faces, and my mother clutched her pearls, and my father turned white, and Bianca stopped blinking, and Terence began to explain that due to a violation of Clause 12 Section B of the trust they had been removed as trustees effective immediately, and he played the audio recordings for them right there in the room, the call where I begged for help, and was dismissed the call where Nurse Tamika clearly stated it was a life-threatening emergency, and my mother hung up, and then he produced the signed affidavit from Tamika and the security footage from the paint store with time-stamps proving exactly where they were and what they were doing while I was being wheeled into surgery, and no one said a word as the evidence kept stacking, and then he read the clause out loud about gross negligence and moral failure, and how in the event of such a violation all trustee rights would be revoked and transferred to the most competent and moral beneficiary. And then he looked directly at me and said that beneficiary was me, and the silence that followed was total, and then Bianca screamed no, and my father shouted that this was a setup, and my mother stammered and asked what this meant for their accounts and their cars and their house, and Terence told them that all their access to trust assets had been terminated, that their credit cards would be canceled, and that they would be personally liable any outstanding expenses, and Bianca wailed about her $2 million mansion, and my father turned red with fury and tried to bark commands, and then my mother collapsed onto the floor and fainted, and it was all happening so fast, yet I lay there calm watching the entire empire of entitlement that had built crumble in real time, and when Nurse Tamika entered and said visiting hours were over and that they had to leave, Marcus tried to argue, but she had already called security, and as the guards escorted them out, still shouting, still panicking, I closed my eyes and exhaled because for the first time in my life I was not the forgotten daughter or the backup plan. I was the one with the power, and they were finally about to learn what it meant to be ignored. The hallway outside my ICU room was quiet again, and the sound of my family's voices arguing and collapsing under the weight of truth had finally faded behind the heavy hospital door. And for a moment I allowed myself to sit in that silence, to breathe in the stillness, because it was probably the first time in my entire life that I felt what power actually meant, not the loud, desperate kind that people like Bianca chase, not the controlling kind my father used like a weapon, or the manipulative kind my mother used in her voice and timing, but the kind that comes from truth, from clarity, from being the one person in the room who sees everything and is no longer afraid to act on it. And just as that thought settled and the door opened again with a soft click, and Nurse Tamika returned, her expression calm and professional, but with a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes as she approached my bed with a thick folder in her hands, and behind her followed Terence, who had stepped out only moments before to make a phone call, and now walked back into the room with that same precise authority as before. And Tamika placed the folder on the table next to me, and explained in her firm, steady voice that the hospital's billing department had processed the full cost of my emergency admission, surgery, anesthesia, and intensive care stay, and that as I was now the official trustee of the Dubois family trust, the paperwork for authorization of payment had been handed over to Terence, who now unfolded the documents and showed me the itemized list, each page a reminder of everything I had physically endured and everything they had ignored, and he looked at me and asked the question slowly and respectfully, "Do you authorize payment from the trust to cover these expenses?" And his voice was firm, gentle, and every person in the room, even the ones who were now gone, were holding their breath through the silence. And I thought back to that moment when my mother had glanced at her phone, seen my name on the screen, and with a sigh and a flick of her thumb, hung up on me in the middle of a medical emergency. And I remembered Nurse Tamika's eyes widening as my mother shouted through the phone, "Is she dying? Because if not, we have a crisis with Bianca, and we will come when we can." And I remembered the click, the dial tone, the way the world blurred out for a second, not from pain, but from that raw, unbearable dismissal. And I looked up at Terence, and I simply said no, and the word was so soft, so small. It barely seemed to register at first, but Terence's expression did not change, and he nodded once and said, "Very well, then they will be personally responsible for the bill," and he neatly folded the papers back into his folder, and Tamika simply said "understood" and made a note on her clipboard, and the moment passed like a storm receding, but I knew it would hit them soon and hard, because now they would not only face public and legal accountability for their negligence, they would also be sent a bill for the pain they chose to ignore and for a trust they had lost in more ways than one. And I could almost picture the scene, the stunned look on my mother's face when her platinum card was declined, the panicked calls my father would make trying to untangle finances he had never actually understood, and Bianca pacing the floor of her half-built mansion, screaming about contractors and unpaid marble slabs, and Josh trying to hold it all together while the foundation of their lives cracked beneath their feet. And I felt no pity, not because I was cruel, but because they had made their choices in full awareness of what was at stake, and had proven again and again that their crisis was always more important than mine. And I was done being the one who swallowed her pain, so they could stay comfortable. And just when I thought the day's reckoning was over, there was a knock on the door. And this time it was not soft or hesitant, but a firm, confident knock, and Tamika opened the door to reveal a uniformed officer and a woman in a blazer holding a leather portfolio, and Terence stood immediately and greeted them both and introduced them as representatives from the local district attorney's office, who had been contacted earlier that morning about the potential criminal implications of my fall and the delay in emergency care, and they had reviewed the statements and the evidence and were now proceeding with a formal investigation into possible charges of criminal negligence and endangerment and conspiracy. And I watched as they listened to Tamika's account and reviewed the audio recordings and took notes and asked clear, sharp questions, and I felt a strange kind of strength settle into me, not because I wanted revenge, but because justice was finally being spoken out loud in rooms where I had once only been spoken over. And when they left, they thanked me for my cooperation and said they would be in touch and promised to follow up within 72 hours, and I nodded slowly and felt the exhaustion of truth finally acknowledged wash over me. And later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the hospital room dimmed into a soft twilight, Terence returned once more, and this time he brought a different document, one that looked older, thicker, with delicate embossed edges, and he placed it in my hands and told me it was the original signed copy of my grandmother Althea's final amendment to the family trust, written just months before her passing. And as I opened it, my hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper reverence, and Terence leaned close and pointed to a passage in the middle of the page, written in Althea's exacting legal language, but with an unmistakable undercurrent of emotion, and it read, "In the event that my son Marcus or his wife Vivian shall at any time demonstrate willful disregard for the life, safety, or well-being of any beneficiary, especially in moments of medical crisis or financial need, then their roles as trustees shall be terminated immediately and irrevocably, and full authority shall pass to the sole remaining beneficiary, who in my estimation possesses both the moral integrity and financial acumen to protect the legacy of this family, and that beneficiary is Chloe. And I stared at the sentence and reread it again and again, and felt the words sink into me like armor, not a gift but a responsibility. And I looked up at Terence, who simply said she believed in you, and I closed the document slowly, and felt something shift deep inside me, something that had been waiting to be claimed for years. And I knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that there would be court dates and threats and tantrums and headlines, but I also knew that for the first time I was not alone, and I was not powerless, and the empire they had built on appearances was now mine to dismantle or rebuild, and I would choose truth and substance over gloss and gossip every single time, because I was not the forgotten daughter anymore. I was the trustee, and I was ready. The silence of the room after everyone had left was something I would never forget, because it was not the kind of quiet that came from peace, but the kind that followed an explosion, the kind that let you feel the weight of what had just happened and what could never be undone. And I lay there in my hospital bed, the machines beside me humming steadily, the rhythm of my heartbeat now a strange comfort instead of a warning. And I thought about all the years I had spent trying to shrink myself to keep the peace, to stay out of the way, so Bianca could shine brighter, so my parents would have less managed, so the family image would stay polished and proper, and how all of that had collapsed in a single morning, and not because I had planned it, but because they had finally gone too far, because they had ignored the wrong call, and they had said the wrong words on a recorded line, and they had put their paint crisis above my life, and now the world and the law were finally seeing them the way I had always seen them. And what followed after that morning was a series of rapid events that unfolded like dominoes, and each one fell with the kind of finality that made it clear there was no going back, because Terence filed all the paperwork with precision and speed, and within 48 hours the emergency hearing had taken place, and the judge reviewed the evidence without even raising a single question, because it was all so clear, so well documented, so damning, that even the most expensive lawyer in the city could not twist it into anything else. And the court officially and permanently removed Marcus and Vivian as trustees, and installed me in their place with full legal authority over the entire Dubois estate. And the moment that gavel came down, something inside me that had been cracked and bruised for decades finally sealed shut, not healed exactly, not yet, but protected like scar tissue that grows stronger than the skin that came before. And that same afternoon Terence and I met with the Trust's Financial Advisory Board, and we went line by line through every account, every project, every outgoing wire, and approved budget, and I froze nearly every discretionary spending plan in motion, including Bianca's $2 million construction project, which had already gone over budget and was riddled with violations and safety risks, and I declared the entire build a liability, and informed the contractors and vendors that the trust would no longer be responsible for unpaid invoices, and I explained that the previous trustees had acted outside the bounds of fiscal responsibility, and their approvals were now null and void, and I could almost hear Bianca's voice in my head screaming when she would find out, and how her perfect dream house would stop mid-frame windows without glass marble slabs, sitting unpaid, and delivery trucks driving away because the money was gone, and her tantrum would not move me, not this time, because I was not afraid of her voice anymore. And then there was Josh, who had filed a formal objection to the funding freeze on the grounds of breach of contract, and Terence responded with an affidavit of negligence, a compiled report on safety violations, and a notice of intent to recover the last payment drawn from the trust. And when Josh's lawyer tried to argue, Terence played the audio recording of Bianca telling Josh not to call for help because of what it would do to his career, and the room went so quiet you could hear the air shift. And the lawyer quietly said they would reconsider their options, and Josh left the meeting looking 10 years older, and I did not flinch because I had watched them all spin lies for years, and now they would have to sit in silence and watch the truth do its work. And the next day I received an official letter from the hospital's billing department confirming that payment had not been received from Marcus and Vivian, and the total amount due was now considered overdue and late fees would begin accruing, and they requested alternative contact information, and I instructed them to send the invoice directly to the family estate with a clear note stating the trust no longer covered their expenses, and I made sure a physical copy was hand-delivered and signed for, and within hours I received 3 missed calls from my mother and 2 from my father, and I did not return any of them because this was not a misunderstanding or something to be smoothed over. This was a consequence, and consequences not negotiate. And Bianca left a voicemail that started with screaming and ended with sobbing, and I listened to every word and deleted it and made a mental note to block her number the next day. And as all of this happened, I began to realize how deep the damage had gone over the years, not just to finances but to people, because the house staff, the assistants, the lawyers, the managers, they had all been living under the shadow of my parents and their impossible demands and their entitlement, and now with them gone, those same people began to send me quiet messages of thanks and relief, and one housekeeper who had worked for the family since I was in high school told me through tears that she was finally able to breathe again, and I felt that in my bones, because I was finally breathing too, and not through the shallow panic of survival, but through something deeper, the breath of someone who had endured and emerged not bitter but awake. And through it all Terence remained by my side, not as a rescuer, but as a witness, someone who had seen too many families break under the weight of greed, but was now watching one rise from the ashes because someone finally said no. And in one of our late night meetings he looked at me across the long polished table and said, "Your grandmother saw this coming, and she believed in you, and I hope you believe in yourself now too." And I nodded, because I did, and not because I had won, but because I had survived and reclaimed my voice and the trust and everything it represented. And in the days that followed, reporters began calling because news of the emergency court ruling and the trust transfer had leaked, and headlines began to appear calling it a scandal, a legal drama, a fall from grace. But I refused every interview, declined every camera, and issued only one statement through Terence that said the Dubois Family Trust had undergone a change in leadership due to serious violations of its founding values and would now be managed with integrity, transparency, and accountability. And that was all I needed to say, because the truth did not need to be shouted or sold. It just needed to be lived, and I planned to do exactly that for the rest of my life. The days that followed were a strange mix of silence and chaos, because while the mansion was quiet and no longer flooded with my family's noise, the world outside had begun to react and spin and tear itself apart over what had happened, because the removal of Marcus and Vivian from the Dubois family trust was not just a private event, it was a public statement, and the legal documents were now part of the public record, and the media had picked up on the story of the trust shift, and the leaked details of my hospitalization and the court's decision had turned what had been a personal betrayal into a headline. And even though I had tried to stay away from the spotlight to keep my dignity and privacy intact, there was no stopping the wave that came after, and soon the phones at Terence's office were ringing nonstop with requests for interviews, statements, comments, and of course denials from my former trustees, who were now desperately trying to rewrite the narrative and defend their reputations, because people like my parents never imagine that the story will turn against them. They live their entire lives believing they can control the lens that others see them through, but the truth had slipped out like water through their fingers, and it could not be contained anymore, and I watched it all unfold with a kind of detached calm, because for once I did not need to explain myself or prove my worth or defend my reality. It was all right there in recordings, affidavits, court rulings, frozen accounts, and the trust, which had once been the fortress they used to fund their delusions, was now mine to protect and reshape. And I intended to do exactly that, starting with setting boundaries so firm that not even Bianca's sobs or my mother's pleas or my father's roars could shake them. And one of the first things I did after officially assuming my role as trustee was arrange a full forensic audit of the past 10 years of trust spending, because as a risk analyst, it was not enough for me to clean up the present. I needed to understand the rot that had been allowed to fester under there. rule, and what we found was staggering hundreds of thousands in personal spa trips, cosmetic procedures, clothing, vacations, all categorized under vague administrative costs and trust upkeep. And it was clear that the trust had not just been misused, it had been pillaged under the disguise of family need and lifestyle maintenance. And Terence sat across from me as the reports piled up, and he said quietly, "Your grandmother was right to put this in your hands." And I felt that truth anchor me again, because this was not just about me reclaiming power. It was about restoring what had been broken and giving the trust back its integrity. And in the middle of all this, Bianca had the audacity to send me a letter hand-delivered on thick monogrammed stationery. Not an apology, not a confession, but a demand wrapped in faux concern, where she asked me to reconsider the freeze on her mansion project, because she said it was her dream and that stopping it would crush her spirit and damage her marriage and undo years of hard work. And I read the letter slowly, line by line, and when I was done, I placed it in the shredder without a second thought, because she had not mentioned my fall, or the hospital, or the phone calls, or the fact that she had shoved me, or that Josh had hesitated before dialing for help, and her silence on that was louder than any apology could have been. And it told me exactly where her priorities still were, and they were not with family or healing or accountability. They were with paint, colors, and Instagram aesthetics, and whatever influence she thought she still had. And Josh was no better, because instead of reaching out directly, he tried to go through his attorney, who sent a letter claiming breach of contract and warning of damages if payments were not made. And Terence responded with a notice of gross negligence and informed them that we were filing a counterclaim to recover all disbursed funds due to safety violations and criminal delay in emergency response. And the tone of their next letter changed instantly from threat to begging, and I instructed Terence to ignore it, because I would not negotiate with people who had stood over me unconscious and bleeding and debated what would happen to their permits and careers if they called for help. And the more I stepped into this role, the more I realized how many people had been waiting for someone to finally say no. Because the financial advisors, the board members, the longtime staff, they had all seen the slow decay of the trust's values, but had been too afraid or too powerless to speak out. And now they were stepping forward, not just to thank me, but to offer their insights, their observations, and their support. And I held meetings with every department and every person tied to the trust's operations, and I asked them what needed to change, what was broken, what had been ignored. And the responses were overwhelming stories of budgets denied because they did not benefit Bianca or Marcus or Vivian, or project delayed because they were not glamorous enough, or people punished for speaking truth and rewarded for enabling delusion. And I took every note seriously and began to build a new foundation for the trust, one that centered on real community support, smart investment integrity, and long-term vision. And I began to see what my grandmother must have seen when she wrote that clause, that sometimes the only way to protect something precious is to hand it to the person everyone overlooks, because that person knows how to hold things carefully. And I had always been careful, and now I would be powerful too, but in a way that did not mimic them, because I would not scream or manipulate or silence, I would lead. And in the middle of all of this, a letter arrived, not from a lawyer or a contractor, but from a woman I had never met, a nurse from another state who had read about my story and wrote to tell me how she had once been ignored by her family during a medical crisis, and how reading about what I had done gave her hope that maybe she was not crazy or overreacting or unlovable. And I read her words again and again, and I cried, because it reminded me that pain does not live in a vacuum, and that what I had experienced, what I had survived, and what I had chosen to expose had a ripple effect beyond courtrooms and estates. It had reached someone else who had once felt invisible, and maybe, just maybe, helped her see herself again, and that was worth more than all the money in the trust. And as the days passed and I grew stronger both in my body and in my role, I began to understand that this story was no longer just about me or even my grandmother. It was about legacy and the courage it takes to protect it, and the price of silence and the power of saying enough. And as I looked out the window of office that had once belonged to Marcus, now mine, I saw the city in a different way, not as a battlefield, but as a place where I could rebuild something real, something lasting. And I promised myself and the memory of the woman who saw me when no one else did, that I would honor her name, not with revenge or drama, but with strength and truth, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be. The morning sun poured into the office through the tall glass windows, and for once I let it warm my face without looking away because I had nothing to hide from anymore and no guilt to carry for things I did not do and no shame for being the daughter who did not cry when the calls from Marcus and Vivian stopped coming altogether, and I sat alone in that leather chair that used to be my father's throne, the one he used to control not just wealth, but people, and I looked around at the walls that once echoed with his orders and his judgments, and I felt something shift in me, something permanent and clean, like the last shard of fear had finally been removed, and I leaned back and let myself take it in fully, because this was no longer their empire, it was mine, not because I asked for it, but because I earned it, and now I was going to build something that would last not in marble or chandeliers or champagne brunches, but in quiet decisions, in integrity, in listening to the people who had always been treated like shadows in the background. And the first thing I did that morning was review a letter from a community foundation that had applied to the trust for support 5 years ago, but was denied because Bianca said it was not sexy enough for the family brand, and I read that proposal word for word and approved full funding with a personal note attached thanking them for their patience and courage, and I sent it off with the same clarity I had been using to clean the entire house. And as I looked through more records, I began to see patterns, threads of neglect and vanity and waste that ran through everything my parents had touched, and I followed each one to its source and began cutting them off, not out of vengeance, but out of duty, because I understood now that legacy is not about blood or surnames or birthday parties. It is about what survives you when the noise is gone and the cameras turn away, and I wanted to leave behind something better than what I inherited, something real and strong and human. And around noon that day, I received a message from the estate's head gardener, a soft-spoken man who had worked on the grounds since I was a child and had always seemed invisible to everyone but me. And he asked if I had time to meet because he wanted to share something important, and I invited him up, and when he stepped into the office, he looked nervous at first, like he expected to be scolded or dismissed, and I smiled and asked him to sit, and he told me about a small greenhouse that had been shut down by Marcus years ago, because he said it was an eyesore and a waste, and this gardener had kept it alive in secret using his own money and his free time because he believed the plants inside held something sacred, and he wanted to ask if it could be restored and funded again, and I listened to every word, and then I stood and shook his hand and told him to begin immediately with triple the budget he requested, and his eyes filled with tears, and I felt mine stink too, because this was what leadership looked like, not towering speeches or red carpets, but saying yes to someone who had only ever heard no. And after he left, I went down to that greenhouse myself, and when I stepped inside, I was surrounded by the scent of earth and life and resilience, and it reminded me so much of my grandmother's garden that I had to steady myself, and I whispered a thank you to the air because I felt her there in the sunbeams and the soil, and in my own strength. And then as the sun dipped lower, I returned to my desk and reviewed Bianca's latest stunt, a social media video where she claimed she had been betrayed by her family and thrown into financial ruin by a bitter, jealous sibling. And in the comments I saw people defending her, accusing me of being a snake, of stealing what was never mine, and I stared at the screen not with anger, but with a quiet pity, because she still believed this was about fame and image and likes and followers, and she could not see that what she had lost was not the trust or the money, but the people, the truth, the part of herself that might have once been real. And the deeper I got into this work, the clearer it became that I could not fix them or save them or even reason with them. I could only hold the line, protect the house that had been given to me, and build a future where people like her could no longer exploit it. And so I spent the rest of the evening reviewing education grants and small business applications, and I approved each one with the same care I would give to my own children if I ever had them. And when I finally stood up and walked outside, the night air felt different, not just cool, but clean, like something had been washed away, and I took a deep breath and let it fill me, and as I turned to head back in, I saw a small envelope taped to the side door, and when I opened it, I found a photo of me from childhood holding a medal at a school event with a note on the back in my grandmother's handwriting that said, "Never forget your worth," and I clutched that photo to my chest and stood there for a long time under the stars. And I realized that even though I had walked through fire, even though my own family had failed me at the most critical moment of my life, even though I had cried and bled and stood alone in hospital corridors waiting for someone to care, I was still here, not broken, not bitter, but better. And that was not just a victory, it was a beginning. The following morning I woke up earlier than usual, as if my body had already adjusted itself to the rhythm of responsibility and healing, and I stood at the edge of the estate lawn barefoot, letting the dew soak into my skin while the air was still quiet before the weight of everyone else's expectations came crashing in, and I closed my eyes and listened to the birds and the distant hum of the city, and I felt something I had not felt in years, peace, not the kind that comes from isolation or silence, but the kind that grows from truth. And after a long moment I walked back inside and sat at my desk where a new stack of letters and requests waited for me, and each envelope held a story, a plea, a chance for something better. And I was careful with every one because I knew what it meant to ask for help and be ignored, and I would not become the kind of person who forgot what that felt like. And one of the letters was from a young woman who had aged out of foster care and was now working 2 jobs while trying to finish community college, and she had applied for a small scholarship years ago, but was rejected because Bianca said it lacked prestige. And I read her words, her hope, her struggle, and I picked up the phone and called her myself, not just to approve the funding, but to tell her directly that she mattered. And her voice cracked when she said no one had ever believed in her without conditions. And I told her then, "And there, you do not owe me success, you owe yourself a chance." And I ended the call knowing this was what my grandmother wanted, not parties, not power, but purpose. And I turned to the next letter and the next, and soon the sun had risen high, and I had forgotten breakfast and lunch. But I felt more full than I ever had, and then there was a knock at the door. And when I looked up, it was Ava, the housekeeper, who had worked here since I was 12, and who had stayed on even when Marcus tried to replace her with a rotating staff because she refused to pretend. And she stepped in holding a small velvet box, and she said, "I think this belongs to you." And when I opened it, I found a necklace, a simple gold chain with a charm that read hope, and I remembered it from my childhood, remembered playing with it during long dinners when my grandmother wore it with quiet grace. And Ava told me your grandmother asked me to give it to you when the time was right, and I think now is the time. And I nodded, unable to speak, because there was something sacred in being remembered, in being seen. And I wore it immediately, not for fashion, but for strength. And Ava hugged me tightly and whispered she would be proud. And I whispered back, "I hope so." And after she left, I sat back down and continued my work, because healing is not just about therapy and distance. It is about doing things differently. And one of the emails I opened next was from a journalist requesting an interview, wanting to talk about the family fallout and the legal victory. And I stared at the screen for a long time, because part of me wanted to scream the truth into every camera so no one would ever forget what they did. But I chose instead to decline the request politely, because the loudest statement I could make was in the life I was building, not the drama they craved. And just as I hit send, Terrence walked in holding an envelope and said, "This one might interest you." And when I opened it, my breath caught. It was from Marcus, not a letter, not a heartfelt apology, but a formal request for a meeting to discuss terms of reintegration into the trust. And I let out a hollow laugh, because even now, after everything, he still thought this was about deals and terms and negotiations. And I handed the letter back to Terrence and said, "Draft a response. Tell him the trust is no longer accepting his definition of family, and that his seat has been permanently dissolved." And Terrence nodded without question, because he knew what that meant, not just in law, but in legacy. And as he left, I leaned back and looked at the ceiling, wondering how long it would take for them to realize that the door had closed and would never open again. And a few hours later, I took a break and walked to the garden and sat on the old stone bench where my grandmother used to read. And I pulled out my notebook and began writing, not documents or checks, but memories, because I wanted to remember everything, not just the pain, but the growth, the lessons, the moments of light. And I wrote for hours until my hand ached, and the page was filled with names of people I had helped and moments I wanted to keep close, and I realized then that I was not just rebuilding a trust, I was rebuilding myself, and I was doing it without apology and without fear. And as night fell and the stars began to appear, I felt something close to gratitude, not for what had happened, but for what I had survived, and I stood and walked back inside, and before bed, I opened one final message, an email from a nurse at the hospital, the same one who had sat beside me when I was alone and scared, and whose kindness had stayed with me, and she wrote to say she had seen the news and wanted me to know how proud she was, and how my story had inspired changes in hospital policy to ensure that no one would ever be left alone again during intake. And I read it twice, maybe 3 times, and then I cried because the ripple had reached farther than I thought, and somewhere in that big busy hospital someone else would be treated with more care, more urgency, more belief, and maybe they would not have to wonder if they mattered, and maybe that was the point, maybe that was what all of this was really for, not punishment, not revenge, but change, real lasting change. And with that thought I turned off the lights and climbed into bed. And for the first time in a very long time, I slept through the night, without waking, without worry, without ghosts. The next few days moved slowly but deliberately, like a steady river pushing past old rocks and familiar bends, and I found myself falling into a rhythm that felt both new and ancient, like something inside me had always known how to lead, how to mend, how to build, but had never been given the chance. And I began my mornings with the same walk through the estate, barefoot, across the grass, coffee in hand, letting the world greet me before I greeted it. And every step felt lighter, not because the work was done, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of being unseen and unvalued. And on the 3rd morning I received a package wrapped in brown paper, and when I opened it I found an old journal with my initials etched into the leather, a gift I had been given as a child that I had assumed was long gone, and inside were notes from my grandmother, memories scribbled in the margins, poems, quotes, recipes, even lists of books she wanted me to read someday, and at the very back a note that read, "For when you are ready to be more than what they told you you were." And I closed the journal with trembling hands and hugged it to my chest, because somehow she had always known, and she had prepared soil even if she did not live to see the bloom. And I placed it beside me on the desk and dove back into my work, more focused, more aligned, more determined than ever. And one of the first emails that morning was from the head of a small school in a neglected part of the city, a school that had been denied funding multiple times by the trust during Marcus's tenure because they did not meet the so-called brand requirements. And the principal had written to me, not with resentment, but with hope, asking if I would reconsider, and I not only said yes, but I scheduled a personal visit to meet the staff and the children. And when I arrived, they greeted me with cautious curiosity, and I sat with them, listened to their stories, watched their lessons, played with the kids, and promised them we would rebuild together. And when I left that day, I wrote a personal check to cover their immediate needs while trust paperwork was being processed. And I knew in that moment that every choice I had made to step away from my family's games and lies was worth it, because I could look these people in the eye and offer them not charity but partnership. And the next morning when I returned to the office, Terrence handed me a letter that had been hand-delivered by Bianca's assistant, and I knew before I opened it that it would be dramatic, performative, manipulative, and it was filled with over-the-top apologies and long, winding explanations about how she was in therapy now, and how she realized she had been used by Marcus, and how she missed me and wanted to rebuild our bond as sisters. And I read it 3 times and felt nothing, not anger, not pain, not longing, just emptiness, because I knew her words were carefully chosen, not from truth, but from strategy. And still I did not respond harshly. I drafted a letter that was brief and clear, stating that I wished her healing and peace, but that I would not be reopening the door, and I signed it with my full name, not out of arrogance, but out of ownership, because I had earned it. And in the days that followed, I turned my attention to restructuring the internal team of the trust, replacing board members who had grown complacent or corrupt, hiring advisors from diverse backgrounds who actually understood the communities we wanted to help. And I made transparency our cornerstone, every dollar accounted for, every decision documented, and the press began to notice reached out again and again, trying to find cracks, trying to get a headline, and I kept declining, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted the story to be in the results, not the noise. And during this time, I also met with former employees who had been fired unjustly, people Marcus had discarded for speaking up or asking too many questions, and I brought them back one by one, not as a show, but because they had knowledge and heart and vision. And one afternoon, while reviewing old files, I found something strange, a set of invoices that did not match the records, and I followed the trail. Discovered that Marcus had been funneling money into a side business under a false name, and I reported it immediately to the legal team and froze the assets, because even though I had won the estate and the trust, I would not allow injustice to live in its walls. And that evening, as I sat in garden under the soft pink sky, I felt something lift from me, the last trace of fear, maybe the last trace of needing approval. And I thought of that night in the hospital, the night I needed them the most, and they chose not to come, and how that moment had nearly broken me. But now here I was, not broken, not bitter, but blooming, and I took a deep breath and whispered to the sky, I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. And the wind rustled the trees as if answering, and I smiled and held onto the hope charm around my neck and thought, maybe this is what survival really looked like, not loud, not sharp, but soft, steady, and unstoppable. The morning after my final decision about Marcus, I sat quietly in my room for several minutes before even reaching for my phone, and for the first time in years, there were no notifications that filled me with anxiety, no emails demanding I save someone from the mess they had made, and instead I scrolled through photos of the children from the school I had visited a week earlier, their wide grins, their messy hair, their hand-made thank you cards, and I smiled softly, thinking about how much more honest their joy was than the polished smiles I had grown up around. And I realized then that everything I had been taught about legacy had been a lie, that legacy was not about buildings named after you or funds with your initials. It was about the lives you touched and how deeply you were willing to care. And just as I placed the phone down, there was a soft knock on my door, and it was Terence, holding a cup of tea and a folder, and he said, you should see this, and handed me the file, and inside were the results of the Trust's first outreach program. Since I had taken over statistics, reports, photos, letters, all confirming that the changes we had made were working, and I felt a lump form in my throat, because even though it was just the beginning, it was already more real than anything Marcus or Bianca had ever built. And I stood up, took a deep breath, and walked with Terence to the main study where the new team had gathered for the quarterly planning meeting. And as I entered, they all stood and clapped, not out of obligation, but out of something I could feel was genuine, and I told them to sit, quickly joking that we had too much work to be dramatic, and everyone laughed, and we got to business, and for the next few hours we reviewed goals, budgets, and community partnerships. And I was impressed by the insight and compassion in every single person around the table, and it made me realize again how far we had come from the cold boardrooms of before, where no one cared about people, just numbers. And as the meeting wrapped, one of the younger advisors, a woman named Leela, who had joined just 2 months ago, spoke up and said, I just want to thank you for giving people like me a seat at this table, because people like me were never even allowed in the building before. And her voice cracked and the room went silent, and I nodded and said no one should have to fight just to be included, and everyone deserves a voice. Here and there were murmurs of agreement, and I saw the tears she tried to hide, and I thought of all the times I had cried in silence, wondering if anyone would ever choose me, and now here I was choosing others. And after the meeting, Terence and I returned to my office, and he handed me a list of press invitations, gala invites, offers to speak on panels, and I declined them all politely, and instead asked him to schedule a series of town hall visits in the cities where our grants had gone out. I wanted to meet the people who would benefit from the money, not just shake hands at events. And over the next week I traveled to 6 different places, from small rural communities to crowded inner city schools, and each visit made me more determined and more grounded. And I listened more than I spoke. I asked questions, I remembered names, and I promised action, not Just words, and when I returned home late Sunday evening, I sat at the edge of my bed still in my travel clothes, exhausted but deeply fulfilled, and I opened my inbox, and there at the top was another email from Bianca, this one shorter, almost bitter, saying that it was unfair how easily I had taken everything, and that she was in pain and needed support, and wanted to come back home, and I closed the email without replying, not out of cruelty, but because I had already given her more chances than anyone ever gave me, and I had made peace with her absence, and in that moment I understood that not every story ends with a reunion, and not every wound heals in the way we expect, and that was okay. And the next morning I started writing a letter to myself, something I had never done before, and I wrote about the girl. I used to be the one who cried in the hospital alone, the one who believed she was always second to someone else, and I told her that she was strong, that she had survived, and that she had built something beautiful from the ruins, and I told her that she mattered, and I cried while writing it, not because I was sad, but because I was finally telling the truth, and I folded the letter and placed it inside the old journal my grandmother had left me, and I felt her presence then like a soft hand on my shoulder, like a whisper, saying, "I told you so," and I laughed softly and whispered back, "I finally believe you," and that evening I held a private dinner for the new board, nothing fancy, just good food, laughter, and stories, and at the end I stood and raised a glass, and said, "This is not a celebration of me, this is a celebration of what we are building together," and I saw the way their eyes lit up, and I knew that this was only the beginning. And later that night, as I stood on balcony overlooking the quiet garden, I looked up at the stars and remembered all the nights I stared at the same sky, asking why, wondering when it would get better, and now I had my answer. It got better when I stopped waiting for them and started choosing myself, and the stars seemed closer somehow, as if they too were proud of me. I woke up before the sun that morning, a strange quiet filling the house, as if it too had finally surrendered to the weight of everything we had endured in the past few months. And I stood by the window, watching the sky slowly lighten and thinking about how much had changed in so little time, and not just on the outside, but deep inside me too, the parts of me that used to shrink whenever I heard my mother's voice, the way my chest used to tighten when I saw my sister's name pop up on my phone. That part of me had started to fade, and in its place something steadier was growing, not anger, not pride, just clarity. I made tea in silence and packed my laptop and notebook into a bag, because I had a full day of follow-ups and appointments at the hospital and the school I was volunteering at, and it was strange to no longer have anyone checking in or asking me to bring something for their convenience. And for once I did not miss the noise, because I was finally making room for peace. I arrived at the hospital, and the staff greeted me like family. Now the nurses smiled, the receptionist called me by name, and the patients I had been helping waved as I walked past, and I checked in on Mrs. Elkins, older woman with the sharpest wit I had ever seen, who had broken her hip but still managed to insult the doctor's handwriting with a laugh, and I promised to bring her a new crossword book before the weekend. Then I moved to the children's wing, where I had organized a reading program, and I sat on colorful rugs surrounded by tiny, eager faces as I read stories and answered questions about lions and oceans and flying machines. And for those few hours I was not the girl whose parents left her crying in a hospital hallway. I was not the sister who had been blamed and overlooked and forgotten. I was just someone who mattered to someone else, someone who made children laugh and feel safe. And afterward, when I checked my phone, I saw that I had missed a few calls from Bianca again, and I did not feel guilty, and I did not feel fear. I felt nothing, and it was powerful. I went to the school after lunch, a small public school that had been struggling with funding, and I met with the principal, who had tears in her eyes when she told me that because of the donation I had helped secure, they were finally able to replace the broken library shelves and buy art supplies and offer lunch to the kids who usually skipped meals. And I walked through the hallway and saw the way the children looked at the new bookshelves like they were made of gold, and I thought how strange it was that the people with the least gave the most gratitude, and how I had spent so many years begging people with everything to give me just the smallest kindness, and now I was standing in a building full of strangers who treated me better than my own family ever had. On my drive home, I thought about my mother, and how she used to say that family was everything, and how she would use that phrase to trap me into silence. Shame, and how it had taken me so long to understand that love without respect was just manipulation. I parked outside the house and sat in the car for a while, watching the light fade and wondering how I had survived it. All the surgeries, the neglect, the blame, the betrayal, and I realized I had survived not because they helped me, but because they didn't, and in the absence of their support I had found my own strength. And I walked inside and took a long shower and changed into soft clothes and made dinner for myself, something small and warm and comforting, and I ate alone at the table with a candle burning, not because I needed the light, but because I deserved a little beauty even in silence. And after dinner, I sat down to write notes on the next proposal for the community center, and just as I finished outlining the plan, my phone buzzed again, another message from Bianca, this time just 2 words, "I'm sorry," and I stared at it for a long moment, and then put the phone face down on the table because I did not need to answer, and maybe I never would the next morning. I had a meeting scheduled with a nonprofit that provided mental health counseling to trauma survivors, and they were hoping to partner with the trust, and I listened to their presentation and asked questions and shared my thoughts, and by the end of the meeting we had agreed to fund a pilot program, and the director, a kind woman named Harriet, took my hands and said, "I don't know what you've been through, but thank you for seeing us," and I felt tears sting my eyes because it had been such a long time since anyone had looked at me and seen something good. And afterward, I walked out into the sunlight and let it hit my face, and I did not flinch, and I did not rush, and I took a long breath and held it just a second longer than usual because it felt good to be alive and whole and unafraid. And when I returned home, I found an envelope at the door with no name on it, and inside was a card from my aunt, the only member of my extended family who had quietly supported me over the years. And in the card she wrote, "I always knew you would rise. I just wish your parents had too." And I held the card against my chest and closed my eyes, and for the first time in forever I felt like someone had said exactly what I had been waiting to hear my entire life. And that night I lit another candle and wrote in my journal, not about pain or anger, but about all the things I was grateful for: the children who laughed, the principal who cried, the nurse who remembered my name, the woman who said thank you, the aunt who believed in me, the silence that no longer felt like punishment, and the peace that had started to grow where all the hurt used to live. The next few days passed like slow turning pages in a thick book where every line carried weight and every memory came back, not to haunt me, but to remind me of what I had endured and what I was building for myself. I had stopped answering calls from anyone in my family, and though the silence was strange at first, it began to feel like a blessing because no one was demanding my time or twisting my words or draining my strength. I was finally free to pour into the things that mattered, and each morning I woke up without the usual tightness in my chest. I made breakfast, listened to soft music, and read a few pages from books that used to collect dust on my shelves, and in the quiet I started to notice how even small things could bring joy: the way sunlight came through the window in stripes, the way my tea curled steam into the cold air, the way my heartbeat stayed steady and did not race every time the phone buzzed. I received a message from my father, but it was not an apology. It was short and cold. He said I was being selfish and dramatic, and that I needed to put aside my anger because family comes first. And I stared at the words and realized how hollow they sounded after everything they had done, or rather after everything they had failed to do. I had called them from the hospital. I had begged them to come when I thought I might die, and they ignored me because Bianca was crying over something petty and temporary, and now they wanted me to pretend none of that happened, to sweep it under a rug and smile for their convenience. But I had nothing left to give them. I deleted the message without replying and went for a walk to clear my head. The leaves had started to change, and there was a crispness in the air that made everything feel sharper, more real. I walked past the old bookstore, the corner cafe, and into the park where I sat on a bench and watched families play and laugh. And somewhere deep inside me, I felt a small ache, not because I missed my family, but because I had spent so long hoping they would turn into those families, the ones who showed up and stayed fought for each other instead of with each other, who listened, who cared, who saw the people they claimed to love for who they truly were. I knew now that would never be my family, and I was making peace with that. I returned home and found a package at my door. It was from one of the volunteers at the community center, a young woman who had just gotten into college, and inside was a handwritten letter saying how my encouragement and help with her essay changed everything for her, and how she would never forget the day I told her she was smart and strong and enough. And I sat down on the floor with the letter in my hands and cried, not because I was sad, but because someone saw me, someone who did not owe me anything, someone who did not have to pretend. And her words meant more than anything my parents had ever said in all my years of living. I knew then that I was not just healing, I was becoming someone new, someone I could be proud of. I started working more hours at the hospital, helping the patients fill out forms, arranging visits, connecting them with services. And each time someone said thank you, it felt like I was planting another piece of my heart into something solid, something real. One evening as I was leaving, I ran into the doctor who had treated me during my emergency, and he paused and asked how I was doing, and I said, better, much better. And he nodded and said, you were in a bad place that night. I am glad you made it. And those few words carried so much truth, because I had been so close to breaking, so close to disappearing into a silence so deep no one would find me. And now I was here, walking upright, smiling, making a difference, and it felt like a quiet victory. I met with the board of the charity fund and presented the next phase of my proposal, and they approved it unanimously, and I walked out of the room with my head high and my shoulders relaxed. And later that night I took myself out to dinner alone, not because I had no one to go with, but because I finally wanted to enjoy my own company. I sat by the window, ate slowly, and watched the world move around me. And when the waiter asked if I was celebrating something, I said, yes, I am celebrating me, and he smiled and brought me a slice of cake on the house, and for the first time in a very long time, I blew out a candle for myself without wishing for anyone else to love me better, because I had learned to do it on my own. I spent the weekend helping organize a drive for winter clothes, and saw so many people come together, bringing jackets and boots and gloves and warm smiles. And I stood at the edge watching children pick their favorite colors and elderly folks laugh over mismatched scarves, and I thought, this is what community looks like, not perfection, not wealth, not blood, but care and action and presence. I got a voice message from Bianca the next day, her voice shaky, saying she missed me, saying things were falling apart at home, that our parents were fighting more, and that maybe she finally understood how hard it had been for me. I listened to it twice, and still I did not know what to say, because part of me wanted to comfort her the way I always had, and another part of me remembered how many times she had watched me suffer and said nothing, and I knew I needed more time before I could decide what forgiveness looked like for me, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that protects its own peace. I went back to the hospital on Monday, and one of the young boys I read to gave me a drawing of us with capes, and he said, you are my hero, and I taped it to my fridge when I got home and stood there looking at it until the tears came again, because I never imagined I would mean that much to someone, and it made me think about how much I had begged for crumbs of affection from people who never saw me, and now here I was being called a hero by a child who only knew me for my kindness and not for my wounds or my scars. And I finally saw the reflection of who I truly was, someone brave, someone generous, someone who had turned pain into purpose and loss into light. Days passed with the calm certainty of someone who no longer waited for validation from the people who once made her feel invisible. I had embraced the peace that came from detachment from the constant emotional tug of war my family used to pull me in to, and now I spent my time working at the hospital, leading community projects, and simply being present in my own life without walking on eggshells or apologizing for my existence. One morning, as I was reviewing schedules at the help desk, one of the senior nurses approached me with a soft voice and asked if I would be willing to speak at the Hospital's donor luncheon, since many of the volunteers and staff had mentioned my work, had changed the atmosphere of the ward. I was stunned, but agreed because even though public speaking had once terrified me, now I saw it as another way to reclaim my voice and tell my truth from a place of strength. Rather than survival, I spent the next few days drafting what I wanted to say, carefully balancing professionalism with personal experience, and when the day came, I stood at the front of that small room filled with people in suits and white coats and shared a piece of my journey, how I came into that hospital broken, how I stayed and healed, and how now I used every ounce of that pain to lift someone else out of their darkness. The applause was kind and polite. But what mattered more was the nods, the tears, the handshakes after people who told me my story had reminded them of someone they loved, helped them understand their own battles a little better. I left the room lighter than I had entered, because now my past had become a bridge, not a burden. Later that evening, I got a message from a family friend, someone who used to know me as a child, and she said she saw the hospital's social media post about my speech and wanted me to know she was proud of me, that she remembered how quiet I used to be, how overlooked, and it meant the world to her to see me shine now. I thanked her and turned my phone off for the rest of the night, not because I was avoiding anything, but because I wanted to sit in that feeling without distraction. The next morning, I walked through the park again, where the air had turned colder and the trees stood bare but still beautiful, stripped of their leaves, yet not stripped of their dignity, and I felt that mirrored something inside me too. I had been stripped of illusions, of false hopes, of forced roles, and yet I remained whole, dignified, free. I received an email from the scholarship board approving additional funding for the community mentorship program, and I immediately called my contacts to start planning the expansion. We were going to include workshops for teenage girls on boundaries, self-worth, and emotional safety, and it felt like the most meaningful thing I had ever done, giving tools I never had when I was their age, helping them build armor from the inside out. On the weekend, I volunteered at a local event, giving out meals and warm clothes to unhoused neighbors, and while handing a blanket to an elderly woman, she looked me in the eye and said, "You are a good one, you are not like the others." And I nodded quietly, because there was no need to explain that I was only different because I had learned the hard way what abandonment felt like, and I never wanted anyone else to feel it if I could help it. Later that night, while sipping tea in silence, I received another message, this time from my mother. She wrote that she missed me, and that she did not know how to fix things but wanted to talk, and my hands froze above the screen. I stared at her words, searching for sincerity between the lines, but all I could feel was the weight of years. When she looked through me, when she chose my sister's tantrums over my tears, when she labeled me as difficult just because I dared to express pain, I left the message unread, not out of cruelty, but because I was not ready, and maybe she would never understand that silence was not revenge, it was recovery. The next day at the hospital, a young girl I had been mentoring surprised me with a card. It had stickers on the front and glitter around the edges, and inside she wrote, "Thank you for making me feel like I matter." And I had to step away to collect myself, because those words hit deeper than anything my family had ever said. They reminded me why I did what I did, not for recognition or to prove a point, but because I knew how rare it was to feel seen and valued, especially when your own blood made you feel small. I spent the rest of the week finalizing our program schedule for the next quarter and coordinating with guest speakers and local leaders, and I realized how much I had grown from the woman who once begged for scraps of affection to someone who created spaces of affirmation for others. I had become my own home. One evening, I was walking back to my apartment when I saw Bianca sitting on the steps, waiting, her eyes puffy, her hands twisting in her lap. She stood when she saw me, but did not move closer. "I did not expect her," she said, and I did not respond. She looked down, then said, "I messed up. I know that now, and I need you to know I was wrong. I was selfish, and I believed things that were never true, and I let Mom and Dad turn me against you because it was easier than thinking for myself. I listened, but kept my arms crossed, not out of anger, but to hold my own heart steady." She continued, "I do not expect you to forgive me or talk to me, but I just needed to say it out loud, because I cannot keep pretending like it did not happen." And then she walked away without asking for anything more, and that was the first time I saw her not as the golden child or the manipulative sister, But as a broken girl trying to find her own healing, I sat on the steps after she left, letting the air settle around me, and I thought about how far I had come, not in miles, but in mindset, in boundaries, in love for myself. And I knew then that whatever happened next would be on my terms, not theirs, not anymore. It was early in the morning when I stood in front of the mirror adjusting the name tag on my coat before walking out the door. I had been asked to meet with the hospital's board again to discuss extending our mentorship program into the schools in our district, and I felt a strange mix of excitement and responsibility as I walked through the corridors. I used to avoid eye contact, and now I was confident, now I belonged. I passed through the nurse's station and was met with smiles and warm greetings from people who once barely acknowledged my presence. And though I smiled back, a part of me still felt like that girl who had waited for someone to believe in her, who had hoped her pain would matter to someone other than herself. After the meeting, which went even better than I had hoped, I sat in the quiet corner of the break room sipping water and scrolling through my messages when I saw one from my father. Just his name blinking there was enough to make my heart stutter. He had written only a few words saying he wanted to talk and hoped I would call him when I had time. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of anything, just a neutral message dangling in the space between us, and I did not respond because I was not ready, and maybe I never would be. The rest of the day went by in a blur as I helped with patient intakes, filed records, and walked through the children's wing to check on a new admission, a 10-year-old boy with severe anxiety who refused to speak to anyone until I sat beside him on the floor and simply colored with him in silence for 20 minutes. He finally whispered that he missed his mom, and I told him I understood, and I really did more than anyone could know. That night as I walked home, the streetlights cast soft halos on the pavement, and the city noise felt distant like a muffled heartbeat. I got home and set my things down before sitting on the edge of the bed, holding my phone, debating if I should block the number again or just let it be. I decided to leave it. I had no energy for more pretending, no desire to initiate anything with people who had never once shown up for me when I needed them most. The next morning, I visited the shelter again to help organize supplies, and one of the women there, an older lady named Francine, who reminded me of my grandmother, pulled me aside and asked how I kept my light so bright despite all the darkness. I smiled and told her it was not about not having darkness, but learning how to walk through it without letting it swallow me whole. She patted my hand and called me a phoenix, and I laughed because I never saw myself that way, but maybe I should. Later in the afternoon, I got an unexpected call from Jasmine, cousin who used to babysit us. She said she had run into my sister at the grocery store and that Bianca looked terrible. She was crying in the parking lot and said everything had gone wrong. She had lost her job, was behind on rent, and our parents had refused to help her because they were dealing with their own financial issues. I listened quietly, my emotions tangled up in something I could not name. Jasmine asked if I wanted to reach out, and I told her honestly I did not know. I was not sure if I could go back to that place emotionally, or if I even wanted to. Jasmine said she understood, and before hanging up she told me I was stronger than all of them combined, and I hung on to those words for the rest of the day. That night, as I sat with a blanket around my shoulders and tea in my hands, I thought about Bianca, how she used to cry over the smallest things, and how my parents always bent over backward to fix her world while mine stayed shattered, and I wondered if she was finally seeing the truth that love built on conditions and favoritism is never real love at all. Maybe now she would understand what it felt like to be on the outside looking in, to beg for help and hear silence instead of comfort. And I felt something shift inside me, not quite satisfaction, but not pity either. Maybe it was acceptance. The next day, while working in the community garden project with a group of teens, one of the girls asked me how I knew so much about starting over, and I smiled and said because I had done it so many times that it became second nature. We planted seedlings and talked about dreams and fears, and for the first time in years I felt like everything I had endured had purpose, like all that hurt had not been wasted, because now I used it to build something better. Later that evening I received another message, this time from Bianca. She wrote that she knew I probably hated her, and that she had no right to ask me anything, but she was drowning, and she just needed someone to talk to. I stared at the screen, my chest tight, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, and I thought about all the nights I cried alone, all the times I called and no one picked up because her meltdowns were more urgent than my emergencies. I thought about the pain of being invisible, and I told myself I owed her nothing, but I also knew that choosing peace did not always mean turning your back on others. Sometimes it meant setting firm boundaries while still offering grace. So I wrote back not a long message, just one line asking if she had somewhere safe to stay. She replied immediately saying she was staying with a friend for now, but it would not last, and she just wanted to explain. I told her I was not ready to meet, but she could write if she needed to, and I would decide from there. It was the first thread of something, maybe not forgiveness yet, but not vengeance either, just quiet space where healing might begin. I put my phone away and watched the city lights blink in the distance, thinking about how far I had come, not just in distance or achievements, but in clarity. I had once believed that healing meant everything going back to how it was now. I knew healing meant creating something entirely new on your own terms, not waiting for others to change, but choosing to rise with or without them. Everything about that final day felt surreal, like I had stepped out of my own life and into the kind of story that happens to other people, not people like me who followed rules and kept their heads down. But there I was, walking into a courtroom where truth would finally be heard, and for once I was not the one trying to be quiet or small. I walked past the long wooden benches where people whispered among themselves, and the click of my heels echoed like defiance against everything I had endured for years and years. My sister sat 2 rows behind with her eyes red from crying, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together, while my parents sat beside her like a united front, refusing to even glance in my direction. I took my seat up front as the judge entered, and everyone stood and then sat again. And when the proceedings began, it was not just my story being told, it was my entire history brought into the light. Every ignored phone call, every moment of pain, every time I was told to understand or be quiet or take the blame so someone else could feel better, every time I was made to feel like I did not matter while they pampered her because she cried louder than I did. And lawyers laid it all out without any need for extra drama, because the facts spoke for themselves and they hit like stones one after another. And I could see the discomfort spreading across my mother's face, as if only now she realized this was not going to end the way she thought. My father kept shaking his leg, eyes darting between the judge and my sister, who was now visibly trembling. And when the hospital records were read aloud detailing the exact timeline of events the day I had been admitted, how many times I had called them from that emergency room, and how many times they had declined to answer because she had been having another one of her breakdowns, I saw the judge's eyes narrow, and I felt a shift in the room, like the air had become heavier, and they could not undo what they had done. No amount of excuses could erase the timestamps on those calls or the voice messages I had left, pleading for someone to come because I was scared and alone and in pain. And no one came, not even when the doctor himself had tried to reach out, and was met with silence because their golden child had been having a hard time, and nothing else mattered more. And I remembered sitting in that hospital bed, staring at the wall, wondering if maybe I really was the problem, if maybe I deserved to be ignored like that. But now I knew better. Now they all knew. And when my sister tried to speak, crying harder, saying she had not known I was in the hospital, and that no one had told her, and that she had not meant to take up all the space, I almost believed her for a moment. But then the screenshots were presented showing her texts to our parents that day, complaining that I was being dramatic again, and probably exaggerating, and begging them not to leave her alone because she could not handle it if they went to me instead. And those texts shattered the last bit of illusion they had tried to maintain, because they showed the truth that she had known and still chose herself, and they chose her too. And I watched my mother's hands start to shake and my father's jaw tighten as the judge leaned forward and asked them to explain their reasoning, their choices. And for once they had nothing to say, no long speeches about sacrifice or emotional strain or parenting under pressure, just silence, because the truth was undeniable. And when the judge delivered his final statement, he did not raise his voice, he did not scold them, he simply stated that their neglect had consequences, real ones, and that their daughter, meaning me, had been left in danger due to their willful disregard. and that while the court was not about to decide how they loved or who they prioritized, it was clear that they had failed as guardians in a moment when it mattered most, and though there would be no prison sentences or dramatic punishments, that judgment alone was enough because it was public, it was recorded, it was official, and I saw in their faces the first signs of something like regret or may be just embarrassment, and I did not need anything more. I had not come here for revenge. I had come here to be seen and heard and believed, and I had been all of those things. And as the room emptied out, my sister approached me hesitantly, her hands trembling, as she said my name like it still meant something, like she could fix it. But I did not flinch or move. I just looked at her and said, "I hope you get the help you need." And then I walked past her down the courthouse steps into air that felt clean. For the first time in years I could breathe again. And not once did I look back, not when I reached the sidewalk, not when I heard my mother calling my name, not even when my father called me ungrateful under his breath. I had already given them enough of my life, enough of my time, enough of my tears, and now I was done, completely and finally done, and it felt like freedom, like the start of something new, something mine, something real. Outro. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.